Welcome back, I'm Off TV viewers. Today's topic is going to be international business and the role of culture. One of my favourite topics, actually. I find this absolutely fascinating. And those of you who have been wise enough to buy the textbook will find it all laid out for you in detail in chapter 16, where I discuss the roots of culture, its impact on business, and how you can analyze culture for the purposes of business strategies. Uniquely, though, in the textbook and in this lecture, I'm going to be looking at the darker side of culture, the prejudices, the nasty aspects of racism and sexism and all of that bigotry, which actually is an important part of making that investment decision. You're not just investing in a country because you think they have a nice attitude to collectivism, or you like the fact that they're independently minded. You're also concerned with their attitudes toward gender, child labour, racist policies. All of that kind of thing can be a deal breaker. So you need to know this in advance. What I start with in the lecture, but can't hear because I can't play the music, is I play a piece of music and I ask you to empty your minds, listen to the music and look at the pictures and just see which picture you think best suits the music. The first one, by the way, is Nimrod by Elgar, and in the next slide we've got something by Gershwin, a jazzy piece of music, and this one is actually easier than the previous one. But you might be asking, why do I do this? What's the purpose of this? It's not just to so we can spend 5 minutes kicking back and enjoying a little piece of music. I'm trying to get a message across. Now, what I'm saying with culture is that I believe it's all quite superficial. It's a form of behavior that we learn. It's not something innate. It's not in our genes. There's nothing genetically setting apart the British from the French, or the Germans from the Chinese, or the Japanese from the Argentinians. I'm saying that this is all on the surface, and underneath, all human beings are the same. It is irrespective of nationality, race. If you believe in race, I believe there's only one race, the human race, but all of those other aspects of culture that we like to use to set ourselves apart from each other. I'm saying that underneath it all, we're all the same, but that there are subtle, fundamental differences. That's the part that I concede. That there are these small but significant differences between us. And I'm saying, or I think I'm saying, that it comes out in art. It comes out in almost imperceptible ways. So there will be a piece of music which somehow epitomizes the character of that culture, and that people outside of that culture don't fully understand it. And actually people within that culture may not have that self-awareness. I'm rambling on. Does it work? Well, if you go back to that previous one, if you go back to that previous picture with Elgar playing, the most English of composers, the scene on the left, the most English of scenes, it's actually the Malvern Hills where it was composed, and I thought the two go together exactly. And what happened was that people, year in, year out, would go 50% for that picture, 50% for the picture of the Antarctica. It completely failed the point that I was trying to make. And then I realized, no, it's actually making my point, because it means then that actually culture really is just on the surface, and that fundamentally we are all the same, and we can learn about each other's cultures, and we can appreciate music from different nations, different parts of the world. We can appreciate their food, we can appreciate their humour, we can appreciate their literature, and that actually is perfectly possible for a Chinese pianist to be able to play Chopin, the famous Polish piano composer. And they can do it as well as anybody else on earth. We can listen to jazz just like an American. It may be jazz may be an American style of music, but we can all appreciate it. And the point I'm making is that culture is something that you can learn about and you can assimilate to. It doesn't matter if you're an immigrant, if you're a refugee, you can assimilate into the culture as much as you want to. You may want to retain parts of your old culture, but not because it's in your genes, not because you're born with it and you can never get rid of it. And as long as you keep breeding within your culture, it'll stay there. I don't believe that at all. Yeah, and you can go to a foreign country and you can assimilate with that culture, and you can learn to be French, assuming you go to France, and you can learn to be a connoisseur of French cheeses, or a big fan of French wine, if that's what you want to do. And if anyone turns to you and say, "Oh, you can't possibly understand France, you're not French," I think they're wrong. I think you can learn to understand. However, and this is where I first start to touch on the on the more reprehensible side of culture, it's a way we have of separating ourselves from our fellow human beings. We claim a particular set of qualities for ourselves, and that means that other cultures don't have those qualities. It's a prejudice. So we sit here in the United Kingdom and we look at the French and we say, "Oh, you can't trust the French. The Germans, they work too hard. It's Spain, Italy, it's too hot to work. So they can't possibly work as hard as us." We can go around Europe with all of these prejudices. And the funny thing is, they have prejudices against us. They have prejudices against each other that we're perhaps not aware of. Maybe it's harmless. I don't think so. I think it's the start of something. Language is also thought of as one of the great totems of culture, and how you express yourself is believed to be unique to a culture. So some languages will have a way of expressing things which seem untranslatable. And because they're untranslatable, it's as if the people speaking that language are having a unique experience, an experience that we can't have because we don't have that word. As you know, I lived in Japan for 6 years, and they have a very strange written language. It's strange to us. It's not strange to them, obviously. And they've got these symbols, these symbols that are so mysterious to us. And once you learn where the symbols come from, you realise it's not mysterious at all. In fact, it's all quite sensible because they're pictographs. They are pictures of the thing that they're referring to. What's this one? To you, it just looks like a load of squiggles, until I say it's a picture of a tree. And then it becomes much clearer. It makes much more sense. There are other ones. What's this? There's a living thing, about 2 meters tall or less. Well, it's a person. And sticking with that theme of human beings, what's this? It's a woman. Why? Because it's a woman sitting down cross-legged, as she would be in Japan. Another human being, I think this one's a little easier. It is a baby. And the language is modular. You can combine these different symbols, these pictographs, or kanji, as they're called in Japanese. And if you put woman and child together, you've got love or like. Does this mean that the Japanese think in a different way? I don't think so. I don't believe this at all. It is a completely different way of depicting their language a language in a written form, but it doesn't mean that the Japanese think in a modular, graphic way. If that was true, then it would come out in other ways, and the Japanese would do the world's most famous paintings. And they do some lovely paintings, but it's not as if Leonardo da Vinci is second to any Japanese artist. The other funny thing about these symbols is that, of course, they're not Japanese. They're Chinese. And they're able to take these from China and adapt them to the Japanese language, which, by the way, is a completely unrelated language. Japanese and Chinese have nothing in common. For those of us who are not so familiar with Japanese and Chinese culture, it's easy to get them mixed up, and we can be forgiven for doing that. I lived in Japan, so I don't get them mixed up. But I can't criticize people who do get them mixed up, who think Japanese and Chinese more or less the same thing. Actually, they're totally different. They're as different as any languages could be. Coincidentally, I think there is one word in the English language that depicts the thing it's referring to. And it's bed. I think the word bed looks a little bit like a bed. Okay, maybe you're not convinced. And then taking this a step further, this feeling that culture is unique to us, and it means that we think in a different way, and that it sets us apart from our fellow human beings, it then leads to trouble. And here we have a country that's becoming increasingly familiar to us. It is, of course, Ukraine, and there's a war going on. Now, 3 years ago, many of us would have thought, Ukraine, Russia, same culture, what's the difference? Well, they see the difference. By golly, they're seeing the difference now. Yeah, and people are being killed by the thousand to assert that cultural difference. As far as we know, Vladimir Putin is not after any kind of resources in Ukraine. He just wants to stamp his cultural authority on the country. That's as far as we can tell. I'm not making a judgment about this at all, but it is, I think we all agree, a tragic situation. Now in Europe, we've had wars going on, well, since the dawn of civilization. It seems to be the underbelly of civilization, doesn't it? There's the top side of civilization is culture, it's literature, it's the arts, and the underbelly is arguments and war. And people have tried to unite Europe. Napoleon did it in a slightly sort of objectionable way by invading countries, but he wanted to unite Europe as one empire. There was the Congress of Vienna, German and Italian unification. Although we tend to, if you come from a country like Britain that's had borders for hundreds, if not thousands, a couple of thousand years, you look at Germany and you assume Germany's always been there. You think Italy's always been there. But no, since 1870 in both cases, around about. And Germany used to be made up of lots of little states. One of them was Austria, but Austria is Catholic, the rest of Germany is Protestant. So the reason why Austria is not part of a greater Germany is because of that religious difference. Yet another reason for having conflict and war, of course. So they have tried to promote this idea for a long time that Europe should be united around some kind of shared sense of destiny. And in Europe and in Britain even, we've understood that. And Winston Churchill talked about how after World War II we can avoid more wars by creating a United States of Europe. But he didn't think we should be part of it, and we never really have been very easy with the idea of being part of Europe. We see Europe not as a continent, but as a foreign country. So after the war, we were a founder member of the Council of Europe, but not actually part of the European and Steel Community, which was a pact that laid the foundations for the common market, the European Economic Community that came after it, and then the EU that succeeded the EEC. We did try to join the EEC in 1957. Charles de Gaulle of France, for some reason, wouldn't let us in. We seem to think of that as a bit of an insult, really, a bit of a slap in the face. But we managed it in 1973, so 12 years later, and 2 years after that we had a referendum, and after joining, and 67% of the country said they wanted to remain. Not a very high number. So it's about 2/3. That means 1/3 of the country was against being in the common market. That's not the EU. The EU is a much closer union. So this is just the common market. No freedom of movement with the common market. And still 1/3 of people were against that kind of trade pact. We've always been very iffy about Europe. For a while, let's see here, 1991-ish, the support was over 50%, so over half the country supported being in the EU. That dropped away, and it's never really been much above sort of 20 or 30%. More than 2/3 of the country was against being in the EU for most of the time that we've been in. The Brexit vote surely was absolutely inevitable. And perhaps, living in a democracy, we have to admit that's what we want, and that's what you have to go with. Economically, doesn't make an awful lot of sense. And I think probably all the talk about Brexit has got the analysis wrong. It wasn't about the economy, although that's what the politicians talked about, but really it's about fear that our culture, such as it is, was going to be subsumed by the rest of Europe. So a convergence of culture is what we were worried about. There's a lot of confusion about what culture really is, and we often will conflate the idea of a society with a culture with the nation state, and they're not the same thing. A nation state is a political construct. Within the nation state, within a country, you can have several cultures. Now, some countries are fairly homogenous. Japan is fairly homogenous, but not as homogenous as they like to think. Whereas the USA is incredibly diverse. This country is incredibly diverse. My own hometown of Leicester is now a majority Asian city, and I think that's absolutely wonderful. A country can have nations within it. A nation can have cultures within it. Cultural homogeneity and heterogeneity are not mutually exclusive. They can actually come together. They can exist together. And when they come together, when cultures come together, it's not that one culture destroys the other one and is victorious over it. It's about them learning from each other. So there's more innovation and more creativity. There's nothing to worry about in McDonald's hamburgers being popular in Japan, because sushi is becoming popular in the rest of the world. I think we need to draw a distinction between culture, having pride in your culture, and nationalism, which is part of the nasty side, where you believe there's a competition going on and your culture is better and needs to defeat the other cultures. That's what I see nationalism as. Whereas patriotism is about having pride in where you come from and accepting it for its faults. So I'm actually quite proud to be British, but I don't think Britain is better than any other country. I certainly don't think that. And I think there's a lot we can learn from other countries. Fortunately, globalization is beginning to undermine the idea that that one nation is better than another nation. Nevertheless, there is this ugly side of culture, prejudice, and it's based around the idea that culture doesn't just show how we're different, but it divides us. And when we're divided, one group will then claim to be superior than the other. And it's just something they do. It's integral to the nature-nurture debate, which is something that's raging in the world of psychology. Why are people different? Is it because they were brought up, nurtured in a different way? Or is it something they were born with? Is nature made them different? And there are lots of studies about this. I come down hard on the nurture side when it comes to culture. Now, I might be wrong, but the reason why I'm so keen on the nurture side is because it means that we can all learn about other cultures. It means that we don't have to be divided. We don't have to make judgments against each other's culture. Whereas if you take the nature view, you're saying that we can't change, that you can't assimilate, that if someone is an immigrant in your country, they can never be part of your culture. And that's one step away from beginning to make judgments against them, to believe they should be kept separately. That's a step away from taking on prejudices like racism. So you believe that someone, because they're from a different race, they have a different culture, they have that different culture because they're in a different race, yeah, and they should be initially permitted to be separate, and then you want to maintain that separation. And if they're in a minority, of course they're going to miss out on many resources. There's sexism as well, there's ageism. Increasingly, sadly these days, anti-Semitism is returning, the anti-Jewish prejudice. We like to think these days we're enlightened, that we're getting rid of our prejudices. What I'm saying is, yeah, we're getting rid of one set of prejudice, but we're taking on another one. And anti-Semitism is an example of that. And a good example here, I illustrate in the lecture by asking the simple question, what do these two pictures have in common? And people will say, well, they're both smiling. Well, they're both women. Yeah, that's not the heart of it. The heart of it is they're both the same woman. What happened was it was a white woman who identified as black and would then black up. She would tone her skin, and she was getting away with it very successfully. She was a big supporter, actually, of black movements, supporting blacks in the workplace. This is all going on in America, by the way, but supporting blacks registering for the vote. Yeah, and then her parents, her adopted parents, popped up and said, "Oh, actually, really, she's white." And it was a massive controversy. My question to you then is, why should this be controversial? If she wants to identify as anything, why can she not make that choice? So if she wanted to identify as a man, we go, fine. If she wanted to identify as gay, we'd be, yeah, that's okay. You know, we're enlightened people. We're broad-minded. She identified as black. What's the problem? Why do we see this as some kind of betrayal, some kind of deceit? Yeah, I mean, it was a kind of deceit, but if she was a trans woman and hadn't gone around telling people that biologically she was born as a man, we'd forgive her. But because she didn't go around saying, actually, I was born white, the reason why my skin is dark is because I have to tone it, because I have to put dye on it, or whatever it is, I have to black up. Yeah, why is that such a huge problem? I don't have an answer. Maybe you do. So when it comes to business, we take a special interest in culture. All the other things I've been talking about before is, if you're interested in international societies, if you're interested in the world, if you want to travel to other countries, then culture, of course, is part of the attraction. It certainly is for me. And while I say that underneath it all, we're all the same, I still take enormous pleasure from going to other countries and seeing how they do things differently, and seeing their culture and hearing their music and seeing the way they dress and their social norms and their customs, all of that marvelous stuff. Yeah. But in business, we're taking a closer interest because we need to quantify those differences when we're making an investment decision. And it's not simply about differences in language and trade barriers. We're trying to find out whether our investment is going to be at risk culturally. The Japanese, for example, they built up their industrial base post-war, enormously successful. Then they wanted to invest in the US, and their worry was that the American character, the American culture was completely different. And Americans like to think of themselves as very independent thinkers, and if they don't like what the boss is doing, they go on strike. The Japanese didn't like the idea of this because their workers are famously obedient, hard-working, will put in long hours, and that's said to be the secret of their economic success. And they wanted to be able to do the same thing in the US, and they were worried they wouldn't be able to. What they actually found was, when they started building the factories and they trained the workers properly, the workers there were as good as any workers in Japan. Nissan have a factory in the north of England, and it's one of the most successful and most productive factories they have in the world. Nevertheless, we have to make ethical judgments as investors, which as tourists we can just skate over the surface of. So you can go to a country where perhaps they don't treat the poor in the way that we would like, or they don't provide education for children in a way that we would approve of, or they have lower salaries for women that we would turn a blind eye to, or just not be aware of at all. As investors, though, we have to confront it head on. All that racism, sexism, attitudes to bribery, corruption, all of that kind of thing. So we need to have a systematic way of evaluating all of these aspects, because they impinge on the risk of the investment we're making. Here's Hofstadter, 5 different dimensions. Not a single one of them concerns ethics. Some of them I would even have a bit of a problem with. In fact, I've got huge problems with this theory. Individualism versus collectivism. This idea that some societies are all about the individual. Some societies, some cultures are all about collective action. Famous examples: America, very individualistic; Japan, very collectivist. I've lived in both. I can tell you that no country is more group orientated than the United States, even though they go on and on about how individualistic they are. Well, the truth is, any culture is partly, in some areas it'll be individualistic, perhaps within the family, but in the workplace it might be very strongly group orientated, or they have a way of doing it where they emphasize the prominence of the group attitude, whereas in America they're promoting the individualistic side, but they're still working together in teams. In fact, America is a very team-orientated country, and that is probably because it's a very big, diverse country, and the way to keep it together is to keep emphasizing this shared identity. And maybe you could even argue that because they have this strong shared identity, that they can afford to promote this idea that they're individuals, but it comes from these shared roots. I can argue with all of these dimensions based on my experience, not academic knowledge. Trompenaars has 7 dimensions, some of them very similar to Hofstadter's. However, Trompenaars is taking a different perspective. Trompenaars is saying, these are the behaviours I've observed. I don't know what's going on inside their tiny little heads. Hofstadter is saying, this is what's going on inside their heads. That then changes their behaviour. I've said that I argue from, based on my experience with both of these approaches. I could pick every single dimension apart and say, no, my experience tells me exactly the opposite. So why am I even bothering to talk about it? Well, because in practice, they are a help. Otherwise, we're trying to make investment decisions like tourists and say, well, we could invest in Portugal. Seems like a nice place. The weather's nice. The food is good. The beaches are lovely. You can't make a decision like that. So you've got to have something. And there isn't much out there that we can use for assessing a culture. It's a nice, easy, practical management tool. As long as you don't allow your analysis to run away with itself and become too dominant, it's a good place to start. And it means we can now be systematic about looking at different cultures and comparing them. The disadvantages are, though, it assumes that one nation is the same as the culture. One nation, one culture. China isn't like that. America's not like that. Britain with England, Wales and Scotland is maybe not like that. That all countries are more diverse than we let on. Yeah, it assumes, both these theories assume that there are cultural differences and you can do nothing about it. So the Japanese can't go to America and train American workers to work like Japanese workers. They have to work an American way. Totally nonsense. Yeah. So you can train them. You can change the way people behave. And of course, as I've said, immigrants, refugees to a country can learn to assimilate. And you, if you go to live in another country as an expat, you can learn their culture and you can learn as much as you want to learn. Yeah, you can make as many changes as you want to make, not according to these theories. These theories say, no, it's fixed. There are also problems with the research that went into these theories. You're really asking people to make a judgment about themselves. So if you hand out a survey to Americans and say, are you individualistic or are you collectivist? Do you believe in the group or do you believe in the individual? They will say, we believe in the individual. You then collect all these surveys out and you say, Americans are individualistic. Well, yes, that's because they say they are. And then you can look for examples that will confirm it. Well, they will confirm it. But that's because you're looking for confirmation. So there's a big problem with all of this. And as I've said, any theory that reinforces the idea that we're separated by culture is also dividing us. The other point is that it's not able, neither of these theories enable us to make ethical evaluations. Those ethical evaluations that we need and are often the deal breaker. Perhaps a better theory is global leadership and organizational behavior effectiveness. It's based on Hofstadter, but with more dimensions, more research, more empirical evidence. And there are, I think, 9 dimensions. Yes, there are. There are 9 dimensions. Some of them we will already be familiar with. Note number 3, gender egalitarianism. At long last, we've got a dimension upon which we can make an ethical decision. Let's just be careful here. I'm not trying to say that one culture is superior to another, although sometimes we have to be honest and we have to say, well, You know, whatever this country is doing now, or what it was doing 500 years ago, is reprehensible, and we know better. So, you know, do have the courage of your conviction sometimes, but either way, at long last, we've got one dimension here that enables us to say we need gender equality. It's not in that country, or it's not in that country yet, so we can't do the investment. Some of the other ones, number 6, individualism versus collectivism. We've seen that. So do have a look through these. Oh, humane orientation, another ethical one. That's a nice one. And what they do is they cluster these cultures around the common set of characteristics. So we've got the Anglo ones, which are England, Ireland, USA, Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. You know, already I can feel the blood pressure rising, because the idea that, say, England and South Africa are the same, when South Africa for so long was benighted by the evil of apartheid, when we haven't had apartheid here. We've got racism, of course, but apartheid is extreme racism. I don't think South Africa, the culture there, is really like New Zealand or England. Latin Europe, well, that's saying that Spain, Italy and Greece, more or less the same. Well, that's what the data says. I wonder, and I worry that the analysis really is valid. But anyway, those are the different groups. Confucian Asia presumably puts Japan and China together. We've talked about that. Japan is a completely separate culture, but I suppose, you know, when it comes to Confucius, no, I reject that. They are different cultures. And in special cases, for some reason, Germany, Switzerland, South Africa, Canada. Hang on, seen Canada before. I thought Canada was an Anglo culture. Okay, well, it is still a bit mixed up. I think we're still trying to define what culture is. I have a nasty feeling that we've got culture wrong, and that we're seeing it as the cause of many differences in behaviour. And I think the differences in behaviour are actually what we call culture. So if there's a difference, we're saying it's culture, and then we're reversing the rationality, the causality of it, and saying, the culture is changing the behaviour. And I think it may be the other way around. And I think there are other theories that may explain the differences between countries better without simply saying, oh, it's the culture. Anyway, the globe analysis results in this spider's web of a graphic representation, which is quite nice. Another thing about globe is it says this is how they see themselves and this is how they would like to be in the future. For the United States, they want to show more gender egalitarianism. They want to have more gender equality. Okay, that's nice. So if I was making an investment there, and that's what I required as one of my conditions, that's good. That's the direction they're heading in. Power distance, they want to get away from an autocratic society and towards more democracy, more collaboration, more cooperation, and that meets my ethical standards, so that's good. But then we've got performance orientation. At the moment, in blue, it's a little above halfway, so they're vaguely performance orientated, and they want to be even more performance orientated. I find that extraordinary. I think most people would say Americans are very performance orientated. They seem to talk about it enough. So the idea they should be even more performance orientated seems very strange to me. Anyway, that's the kind of result that comes out. All my criticisms have been based on personal experience. You need to use your own judgment. come up with your own opinions. And of course, that's what we're trying to encourage very much in the assignments, trying to show you that after 2 years of academic study, you are now qualified enough to put that together with your experience and have opinions that have solid roots, a solid foundation, and can have confidence in those opinions. They're more than opinions. It's a professional consideration. You can use practical guides when looking at a country, and here's one. So this is a country. I won't reveal the country to you just yet, but have a look at the 4 rules you have to observe in that country according to this practical guide. Don't put your hands in your pockets. Don't touch anything with your foot. Don't touch another person's head. Never write on a business card. What country could this be? Well, the first one, any country. The second one, do not touch anything with your foot. Yeah, I think that's kind of accepted all around the world. Never touch another person's head. Yeah, I would go along with that in any country. I lived in Japan 6 years. I may have mentioned that. I have no idea what a Japanese person's hair feels like. But then again, I've been to Scotland a lot, and I don't know what a Scottish person's hair feels like. I don't know what a Spanish person's hair feels like, because I'm not touching their head. The last one, never write on a business card. Now that it's not exactly unique, but it has a rarity to it. In the West, we treat a business card as a bit of information, and if we want to add more information, then that is entirely our prerogative. In other countries, like, say, Japan, it's seen as a sign, a symbol of a person's status. It has their status written on it, and that's how you know their status. They don't tell you their status is written on the business card. So if you're then scribbling on it, you're defacing something that is not actually a business card anymore. Now, they call it a business card, but it's actually giving different information. And the different information is, this is this person's status, and therefore you don't scribble on it. What country is this then? Maybe you'll be surprised to learn it's Indonesia. My point is that so much of what they warn you about or tell you about in Indonesia is actually common to all countries. If you're an international business person, for goodness sakes, don't go around with your hands in your pockets. You look too casual. Surely you know that. I don't know why you're touching anything with your foot. Don't go around don't touch people. But don't go around touching people's heads. The last one there is specific. And some countries will have rules about touching something with your left hand or touching food with your left hand. Now, in any country you go to, the people will be as tolerant to your ignorance of their culture as you should be tolerant of their ignorance of your culture. But there are some things that you really should revise before you go. Get yourself reasonably informed, because if you do things which are well-known taboos in that country, then it looks as though you can't even be bothered to do the research. If you're in negotiations, then you're a fully qualified business manager now, you've been sent overseas, first thing you do is some sort of cultural review. That's when you do check on what the specific taboos are. So you don't make at least it means you don't end up looking insensitive or completely ignorant. Do a Hofstadter, do a Trumpenaars, do a Globe, whatever suits you. But it is only the first step. It is not going to give you a list of rules. And it means that you are then ready to adapt your negotiating style to the cultural conditions. You're forewarned. You know how things might be a little bit different. They might be negotiating as a team rather than as an individual, so you have to be ready for that. But still, you're not going to be hidebound by the rules that you think you've got from Hofstede. Next step, build trust. So make sure they can trust you and you can trust them, and be patient. Don't try to rush them. Get the best advice, get the best translators, interpreters, get to know local people, and be flexible with the negotiation, and understand that it may well be in their culture that the negotiation is not where you make the decision, and the decision will be made afterwards. So you make your negotiation, that's part of your offer, and then they will go away and think about it and let you know. It might be different, it's said to be different in America, where they want the negotiation to be conclusive and they want a decision at the end of it. Right, what about the ethics? I've said before that this can be a deal breaker. Local legislation is the starting point. You cannot go against the local law. Then you've got your own corporate standards. Maintain those corporate standards. If you're saying in your home country, we make sure that women have the same pay as men, then unless you're going to upset some local law, then you apply that standard. So no one can suggest that you've got double standards. For goodness sakes, that would be unethical. You can hardly claim to be ethical in your home country and apply a completely different set of standards elsewhere. You're simply not being ethical, are you? And also remember that as a big investor, you may have a lot of muscle in the market, a lot of responsibility, and actually you can decide, right, we're going to pay the locals less than we pay our own people that we're sending over there. We're going to pay them much, much less. Yeah, we're going to get this labour on the cheap. You need to accept that with that power comes responsibility, and you need to look after. You have a duty of care over your workforce. And just because it looks to you like human life, that labour is cheap in the country you're going to, don't compromise your standards on that. So that's it. Another a set of useful sources here that you can check out. The International Business Centre is there. So you can look up your own country and take great amusement as to what they think is the rules, the social rules of your culture. Any questions, do let me know. Thank you very much. I'll see you on the other side.